I remember the sound before I felt the pain, the heavy thud of Harold Carter's fist cutting through the stale air of our living room. My body lurched backward and I crashed against the arm of the sofa. He was drunk again. I could smell the cheap bourbon clinging to his breath as he shouted. His eyes were glassy, his face red, and his words landed with the same force as his fists. "You deserve this pain," he yelled. His voice rattled the picture frames on the wall. The next hit made my vision blur. A sharp sting split across my cheek, and when I brought my hand up instinctively, it came away wet. A thin line of blood ran from the corner of my mouth down to my chin. I tasted iron and bile. The room spun, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat, fast and uneven. I was 20 years old enough to vote, old enough to drive, old enough to dream about a life on my own. But in that house, none of it mattered. Harold was the ruler, the provider, the man of the house. To him, I was nothing more than an inconvenience that refused to disappear. "Stay out of this or you're next," Harold barked when my mother took a step forward. She froze instantly. My mother Donna stood near the kitchen doorway. Her face was pale. Her hands shook as she clutched the hem of her sweater. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came. She stayed there trembling, her eyes darting between me and Harold until she lowered her gaze to the floor. The air thickened with silence except for Harold's ragged breathing and my muffled sobs. Then came the click of a phone camera. My stepsister Madison Harold's 17-year-old daughter leaned against the wall, smirking, her phone raised high. "Smile Lily," she mocked. "This one's going online." I wanted to scream at her to snatch the phone away, but my body refused to respond. Every nerve seemed locked in place, screaming at me to survive just one more second. My chest tightened. The beating of my heart turned irregular, sharp jolts of pain, shot through my ribcage, and my breath grew shallow. I felt like my lungs could not pull in enough air. The carpet beneath me felt coarse as I struggled to stay upright. My arms gave way, and I collapsed onto my side. My vision tunneled until only Harold's looming shadow remained above me. The sound of his voice grew distorted, muffled, as if he were yelling underwater. "You will learn respect," he growled. I tried to push myself up, but dizziness dragged me back down. My pulse hammered violently, then skipped, then surged again. I could not catch my breath. My heart raced out of control, pounding so loud it drowned out every other noise. Each beat felt like a hammer strike, and then a sudden hollow pause made me fear it had stopped. Blood smeared the rug where my face had pressed against it. The coppery taste filled my mouth. I gasped, but air refused to fill my lungs. I clawed weakly at the floor, trying to anchor myself, trying not to slip away. I looked up once more. My mother still stood frozen. Tears streamed down her face, but she did not move. Harold's glare kept her rooted in place. Madison laughed quietly as she continued filming, angling her phone for a clearer shot of my crumpled body. I remember thinking in that moment that I might never stand again. My body trembled uncontrollably, not just from the blows, but from the violent rhythm inside my chest. My heart felt as if it was breaking free, desperate to escape my rib cage. Then, everything went black. To anyone watching, it must have looked like my heart had given out completely. For me, there was only darkness, a moment of terrifying silence inside my own body where I could no longer feel the beat that had carried me through 20 fragile years. That was the moment my story truly began. My earliest memory of my father is faint, a warm laugh and the smell of sawdust on his clothes when he lifted me into his arms, but those memories faded quickly because he died when I was 10. His sudden passing left my mother Donna alone and frightened, and within a year she remarried Harold Carter, the man who would later turn my life into a cage. At first, Harold pretended to be kind. He brought flowers for my mother and made promises of stability, but behind closed doors, he was different. He wanted absolute control, not just over money, but over every choice from what food we ate to what clothes I wore. I was just a child then, and I watched my mother shrink into herself. She had been a gentlewoman, always soft-spoken, but Harold chipped away at her confidence. He used words like weapons gaslighting her every chance he got. "I am the provider, you obey me," he repeated so often that it became a law in our household. My mother began to echo his words, maybe because she believed them, maybe because she was too tired to fight. Madison, his daughter from a previous marriage, was only 7 when Harold moved in with us. She quickly realized she could do no wrong in his eyes. He spoiled her, gave her expensive gifts, and excused her every mistake. Meanwhile, I became the outsider in my own home. To Madison, I was competition for attention I never even wanted, and she made sure to remind me daily that I did not belong. By the time I reached high school, the dynamic was set. Harold controlled the finances completely. Every dollar that came into the house went through his account. I was not allowed a part-time job because he insisted it would distract me from chores. Even when I earned small scholarships from writing contests, he made me hand over the checks saying he would manage them responsibly. He was the gatekeeper to everything, and I had nothing of my own. My mother sometimes whispered that she wished things were different, but she never acted. Once, when I begged her to let me apply to a summer program in another state, Harold shouted at her until she cried, accusing her of wanting to tear the family apart. After that, she stopped encouraging me instead, telling me to keep my head down. "It is easier this way," she said, her eyes filled with defeat. I buried myself in books and writing the only escape I could find. In secret notebooks, I wrote stories of girls who broke free, girls who built lives where no one could touch them. It was my dream to study literature and maybe become an author one day, but Harold dismissed it all as worthless. "No one pays for poems," he sneered, tossing one of my notebooks into the trash when he caught me scribbling. He told me to focus on housework instead because that was all I was good for. The sting of his words often hurt worse than the sting of his hand. Madison loved to add salt to those wounds. At school, she spread rumors that I was pathetic, that even my own family did not want me. I became the target of cruel jokes, though I never told teachers. I was too ashamed. Yet there was one person who noticed I was more than Harold's punching bag and Madison's scapegoat. Ethan Miller, a boy from my literature class, always asked about my writing. He treated me as if my words mattered. He did not know the whole truth about my home life, but his kindness gave me something rare, a glimpse of hope. I clung to those moments because at home I was invisible. To Harold, I was a burden. To Madison, I was a joke. And to my mother, I was someone she loved quietly but could not defend. This toxic household shaped every part of me. I stayed not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. Without money, without a car, without a support system, I was trapped. More than once, I thought of leaving with just the clothes on my back, but then I would imagine my mother left alone with Harold's temper. She had already withered so much under his control, and I could not bear the thought of abandoning her completely. That fear chained me to that house, making me endure insults, chores, and the growing shadow of Harold's rage. Looking back, every small choice he made to control us was deliberate. He broke down my mother until she obeyed spoiled Madison, until she adored him, and isolated me until I questioned my own worth. That was the foundation of the family I was forced to live in, a house built not on love, but on domination. The older I grew, the clearer it became that Harold had no intention of ever letting me feel like part of the family. He treated me as if I were a tenant in his house, rather than his stepdaughter. Every insult carved away at me until I felt invisible. I remember one evening when neighbors came over for dinner. We were seated around the table and Harold poured himself another drink before loudly announcing that feeding me was like throwing money into a fire. "She is just an extra mouth to feed," he said, laughing while everyone else shifted uncomfortably. My face burned as I stared at my plate, wishing I could sink into the floor. My mother glanced at me but quickly looked down, saying nothing. Madison giggled and repeated the phrase later at school, turning it into a cruel nickname. Soon enough, other students called me extra mouth in the hallways, and I carried the humiliation everywhere I went. At home, Madison delighted in mocking me. If I wrote an essay, she would crumple it up. If I tried to cook, she would taste the food and make gagging noises. "You will never be good enough for anything," she would sneer, and Harold would nod as though she were telling the truth. Donna sometimes whispered, "Just ignore them, honey," as if indifference could erase bruises on my heart, but her advice was powerless against the steady erosion of my spirit. Slowly, I began to feel like my role in the house was to disappear, to be erased. Harold even made practical moves to diminish me. He excluded me from family photos, cutting me out with his camera lens. He refused to list me on the family health insurance, claiming it was a waste of money. He said I should be grateful he kept a roof over my head. My presence was tolerated only to give them someone to ridicule. Each word of contempt reinforced the idea that I was nothing. And yet, in the darkest corners of those days, there were glimmers of light. At school, Ethan Miller always noticed when I seemed withdrawn. He sat beside me in literature class and asked about my short stories, praising them when no one else cared. He once told me, "Your words have weight, Lily. Do not let anyone make you believe otherwise." His attention embarrassed me, but also stitched together pieces of my broken confidence. It was the only affirmation I had, and I guarded it like treasure. Whenever I returned home from school, though the contrast was brutal, Harold barked orders for chores before I had even set my bag down. Madison shoved laundry at me or accused me of stealing her things. My mother moved through the house like a ghost existing in silence to avoid Harold's anger. I could see the fear in her eyes, but fear did not save me when Harold's rage boiled over. The more he felt I resisted, the harsher his punishments became. He knew how to tear me down in front of others, and that public humiliation often cut deeper than the strikes of his hand. Once, during a barbecue, I forgot to bring napkins outside. Harold grabbed me by the arm, shook me hard enough to make me dizzy, and snarled about my incompetence, while the guests pretended not to notice. Later, he laughed it off as discipline. I knew then that he enjoyed not just control, but also the erasure of my dignity. The steady rhythm of abuse created a numbness in me. I walked through the house careful not to draw attention, careful not to provoke Madison's laughter or Harold's wrath. I learned to lower my voice, to take smaller steps, to shrink into corners. Every day, I felt myself fading more. But somewhere inside, a stubborn ember burned, refusing to die completely. Ethan's kind words kept that ember alive, reminding me that beyond the walls of Harold's house, there might be a life worth living. Still, the contrast between school and home made each insult sharper. When Ethan praised an essay, Harold dismissed it as trash. When a teacher encouraged me to apply for a writing program, Harold tore up the application. My mother whispered apologies at night, but did nothing to stop it. I understood that she was afraid that she too was under Harold's control, but her silence weighed on me like betrayal. Each time she turned away, a piece of me hardened. This was the cycle that defined my late teenage years: to be erased at home, to find fleeting hope in classrooms, to carry shame and bruises in silence. It was a cycle that could only escalate, and deep down, I sensed that sooner or later, Harold's violence would reach a point where my erasure would no longer be symbolic. It would become deadly. The night it all came to a head began with something so ordinary it almost felt scripted by fate. I had just come home from school, clutching a letter that confirmed my small academic scholarship for the next semester. It was not much money, but to me it meant independence, a way to keep my education alive despite Harold's endless interference. I tucked the letter into my notebook, planning to hide it until I could figure out what to do. But Harold had a nose for control, and nothing escaped him for long. He was seated in his worn armchair, the smell of alcohol thick around him when he barked for me to hand over the envelope. I hesitated for only a second, and that was all it took to spark the fire. He ripped the letter from my grasp and scanned it with narrowed eyes. "So, you think you can keep secrets from me? Money belongs to the head of the house, not some useless girl scribbling fairy tales." His voice grew louder with each word, echoing off the walls. My mother stood near the sink, wringing her hands, whispering, "Please." Harold let it go, but her plea was cut short when he turned his glare on her. "Stay out of this," he growled, and she froze as if turned to stone. Madison appeared in the hallway, phone in hand, her smirk already in place. She loved these moments, the drama, the chaos, the chance to see me crumble while she captured everything on video. Harold crumpled the letter and threw it at me, the paper hitting my chest like a symbol of crushed hope. "You are nothing without me," he shouted. I gathered my courage, shaking but firm, and answered, "It is my scholarship." I earned it. The moment the words left my mouth, I knew they would cost me dearly. His face twisted with fury, veins bulging at his temple. He lunged forward and grabbed me by the arm, yanking me so hard I stumbled into the coffee table. Pain shot through my shoulder. I tried to pull away, but his fist came down across my face, knocking me to the floor. The sharp sting of his knuckles left my cheek burning, and when I touched it, I felt warmth and wetness. Blood smeared across my palm, trickling from a cut inside my mouth where my teeth had torn the skin. My vision blurred instantly, the room spinning around me. My chest tightened with terror as my heart slammed against my ribs. He kicked me in the side, and the breath rushed out of me. "Respect," he bellowed, "is what you owe me." Each word landed like a hammer, his boot nearly connecting again before he staggered back slightly from the force of his own rage. I curled on the carpet, my ribs screaming in pain, my pulse racing into chaos. My mother sobbed, covering her mouth with trembling hands, whispering, "Please, stop, Harold, please!" But he snapped at her again, his voice so venomous she could not move. Madison's laugh was low, almost gleeful, as she whispered to her phone, narrating the scene as though it were entertainment. I felt every second stretch endlessly. My chest tightened further, and the rhythm of my heartbeat faltered. It thundered, skipped, then surged violently. Dizziness swallowed me whole. The room darkened at the edges, sound distorting until Harold's rage was only a muffled roar. I clawed at the rug, leaving faint streaks of blood where my hand pressed down. My lungs fought for air that would not come. Each breath rattled shallow and sharp. I thought of my scholarship letter crushed on the floor. I thought of Ethan's voice telling me my words had weight. And then I thought of death, how close it might be in that moment. My body trembled uncontrollably, my head spinning as though the earth itself had tilted. I remember catching one last glimpse of my mother's eyes wide with terror and helplessness before everything collapsed into darkness. To anyone else in that room, it must have looked like my heart gave out that the defiance I had clung to so stubbornly had cost me my life. To me, it was the terrifying void of unconsciousness, a plunge into nothing, where even my own heartbeat could no longer be trusted. When I opened my eyes again, the room was dim and quiet. The only sound the faint hum of the ceiling fan turning lazily above me. My head throbbed with every beat of my heart, a reminder of Harold's fists, and the copper taste of dried blood lingered on my tongue. I was lying on my bed, though I did not remember how I got there. My body ached in too many places to count ribs, sore shoulder, stiff face swollen. On the nightstand sat a bottle of over-the-counter painkillers and a glass of water left by my mother. She had not called a doctor, had not called an ambulance, had not dared to challenge Harold. My chest rose and fell unevenly, but I was alive, and with that realization came another. If I stayed passive, I would not survive much longer. My mother stepped into the room quietly, her face, pale eyes swollen from crying. She whispered that I should take the pills and rest, then glanced toward the door as if afraid Harold might appear at any moment. I wanted to scream at her to demand why she always let this happen, but the words caught in my throat. Her fear was obvious the way she kept her shoulders hunched, her voice small. She was trapped too, though her chains were different. She was bound by years of control, by financial dependence, by terror. But I could no longer accept her silence as my shield. When she left, closing the door softly behind her, I pushed myself upright despite the pain. I looked around my room and thought about everything Harold had taken from me, and for the first time I felt a surge of anger, stronger than fear. If I did not start resisting, I would end up in the ground before I turned 21. That night, under the cover of silence, I pulled out an old cell phone I had hidden in a shoebox under my bed. It was not connected to service, but it could still record. I tested the microphone, whispering into it, then played it back. The sound was faint, but clear enough. I decided then I would start documenting everything. If Harold wanted control, I would use his arrogance against him. He loved to shout to brag about his authority. His own words would betray him. I also began keeping a journal, writing down each incident with the time and date. The bruises on my body were temporary, but my words could last. It was dangerous, but it gave me a sense of purpose I had not felt before. The next morning, when Harold stomped through the hallway demanding breakfast, I kept my head down and answered politely. I played the obedient stepdaughter, hiding my growing resolve. He barked insults as usual, and I pressed record on the phone hidden in my pocket. Later, when Madison mocked me for limping, I wrote it down in my journal. Each entry became a small act of defiance, proof that I existed, that their cruelty was not invisible. During those days of secret resistance, I still clung to small lifelines outside the house. Ethan noticed my absence from class and sent me messages asking if I was all right. I told him I was sick, ashamed to reveal the truth, but his concern warmed me in ways I did not expect. He wrote that he missed hearing my thoughts in class discussions, that he hoped I would come back soon. It was a reminder that beyond Harold's walls, I was more than a punching bag. I was someone worth noticing. I would reread those messages late at night, my bruises aching, and feel a flicker of hope. The contrast was cruel, but it fueled my determination. I began planning more carefully, thinking about safe places to hide evidence. I slipped memory cards into old books on my shelf pages, hollowed just enough to keep them from view. I tucked written notes beneath the lining of my backpack. Every secret stash was a step toward survival. The fear never left me. Every time Harold raised his voice, I flinched. Every time Madison smirked, I wondered if she suspected something. But alongside the fear grew a stubborn strength. I told myself over and over, if I do not fight back, they will kill me. That thought became my mantra. In the stillness of my room, staring at the bruises in the mirror, I promised myself that one day I would walk away from Harold's house, not as a victim, but as a survivor with proof in my hands. Harold must have sensed that something was shifting because within days his grip on me tightened. He began watching my every move more closely, demanding to see my phone whenever he pleased, rifling through my bag, checking my room as if I were a criminal hiding stolen goods. He seemed to thrive on stripping away every ounce of privacy I had left. One afternoon, he stormed into my room without knocking, yanked open drawers, and sneered when he found nothing. "You think you are clever, don't you? But I see everything," he said, his eyes bloodshot from drink. I held my breath and kept my expression blank, terrified he might stumble across the old phone hidden beneath the loose floorboard. After he left, I pressed my back against the door, shaking but also proud that he had found nothing. His suspicion, though, did not fade. He began confiscating small amounts of money from my backpack quarters I had saved from odd jobs at school, insisting that I did not deserve to manage it. He demanded receipts for everything, and when I could not provide them, he called me a liar. Meals became another form of punishment. Madison would scrape her leftovers onto my plate with a smirk, saying that was all I was worth. If I refused, Harold would slam his hand on the table and order me to eat every bite. My mother would whisper, "Harold, please enough," but her voice carried no weight. She would lower her gaze when he glared at her, shrinking into silence. In those moments, I felt utterly alone, yet I still kept my secret phone tucked away, recording his tirades whenever possible. Each rant became another piece of evidence. He did not realize that his own rage was building the case against him. The nights were the worst. He would pace the hallways shouting about bills or my supposed laziness, and I would lie awake listening, the recorder running quietly in my hand. Sometimes Madison joined in her laughter, echoing through the thin walls, mocking me for crying softly into my pillow. It would have been easy to collapse under the weight of it, but I held onto the ember of defiance I had lit inside myself. At school, Ethan saw the changes I tried so hard to hide. I wore long sleeves and heavy makeup, but he noticed the stiffness in my movements, the way I flinched at sudden sounds. One afternoon, he pulled me aside after class. His eyes were steady, filled with concern. "Lily, you do not have to go through whatever this is alone," he said. I forced a smile and muttered that I was just tired. He did not press, but his gaze lingered, telling me he did not believe me. The next day, he texted that if I ever needed a place to stay, I could call him. My heart ached at his kindness, but fear anchored me to the house. If Harold discovered I had confided in someone, the consequences would be unbearable, not only for me, but for my mother. That was the trap he had set for years, make us so afraid of his retaliation that we caged ourselves. And yet, his attempts to tighten control only pushed me further toward resistance. Each insult, each confiscated coin, each forced bite of scraps reminded me that survival depended on patience. I had to keep my secret plan alive until the right moment came. The contradiction defined my days. Outwardly, I acted submissive, nodding, apologizing, doing chores without complaint. Inwardly, I was documenting every bruise, every threat, every cruel word. I knew the risk. If Harold ever found my recordings, he would destroy them and perhaps destroy me with them. But the thought of silence was worse. I could not allow my life to vanish without proof of what he had done. My mother's silence, Madison's mockery, Harold's tyranny, they were all part of a cage designed to erase me. Yet the cage had cracks, now cracks, where light filtered through in the form of Ethan's texts and Evelyn's occasional glance from across the yard. I told myself those cracks would widen one day. For now I endured waiting, recording, biding my time. It happened on a sweltering afternoon when the air pressed heavy against my skin and the cicadas screamed from the trees. Harold had been drinking since noon, his temper simmering just beneath the surface, and by the time I stepped outside to take the trash to the bins, he followed me into the yard. His voice was already rising, accusing me of being ungrateful of stealing from him, because he had noticed a few dollars missing from his wallet. I tried to tell him I had not touched his money, but he lunged forward, his hand gripping my arm so tightly I felt the bruises forming instantly. "Liar," he spat, shaking me so hard that my teeth rattled. I stumbled backward into the patch of dirt near the fence, my knees scraping against the ground. Madison appeared in the doorway, phone in hand, as usual, recording with her practiced smirk. My mother's voice floated weakly from the kitchen, "Harold, please," but she did not come outside. I looked up just in time to see our neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn, peering over the fence. She was 60 years old, gray-haired but sharp-eyed, and she froze when she saw Harold shove me against the ground. For years, she must have suspected something, but I had always hidden the bruises with long sleeves and makeup. Now the truth was laid bare under the glaring sun. Evelyn's eyes widened, her lips pressed into a tight line as Harold raised his hand again. "You are nothing but a burden," he roared, and his palm cracked across my cheek, knocking me sideways. I heard Evelyn gasp. Her voice, firm and clear, called over the fence. "Harold, that is enough." He spun around, startled, muttering something about discipline, but Evelyn's gaze did not waver. She stood taller than I had ever seen her, her hands gripping the fence post. Harold growled and dragged me back toward the house, muttering threats under his breath. My body ached from the blows, but a flicker of hope stirred inside me. Someone had finally seen. Later that evening, Evelyn knocked on our door with a plate of cookies, her excuse to step inside. Harold glared but allowed her into the kitchen. She looked at me closely, her eyes scanning the swelling on my face, and when Harold left the room to fetch another drink, she leaned closer and whispered, "You are not alone, dear." The words nearly broke me. I wanted to collapse into her arms and confess everything, but fear clamped my mouth shut. Still, something in my eyes must have told her the truth because she nodded softly as if we had reached an understanding. That night, she slipped a folded piece of paper into my hand as she left. Inside was her phone number and the words, "Call me anytime, day or night." I tucked it into my journal, my heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and relief. For the first time in years, someone outside the house knew. Around the same time, Ethan noticed how often I was missing from class. He caught me in the hallway one morning, his brow furrowed with concern. "You look like you have been through hell," he said quietly. I forced a laugh, brushing it off as stress, but he did not smile. "If you ever need a place to stay, even for a night, I am here," he told me. The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten. I wanted to tell him everything, but the image of Harold's furious face stopped me. I simply nodded and walked away, but his words stayed with me like a secret lifeline. That week, I began to imagine escape in a way I had not dared before. With Evelyn watching and Ethan offering kindness, the cracks in Harold's control grew wider. He still shouted, still struck me when his rage demanded it, but now I carried more than bruises. I carried witnesses. That changed everything. The breaking point came sooner than I expected on a night when the air inside the house felt charged with static, and Harold's anger had been simmering all day. He had discovered the acceptance letter for a new scholarship I had applied for in secret, tucked between the pages of a book. When he stormed into the living room waving the letter in his fist, I knew the storm was about to break. "You dare to make plans without my permission," he shouted, his spit flying as he slammed the paper onto the table. My mother rushed forward, wringing her hands, begging him to calm down, but he shoved her aside with a force that sent her stumbling into a chair. Madison already had her phone out, eager to capture another spectacle. Harold turned on me with eyes that blazed like fire. "You think you can leave this house? You think you can make a life without me? You are nothing!" he roared. Before I could move, he struck me across the face, the impact knocking me to the ground. My ribs screamed in pain as he kicked me in the side. I curled into myself, trying to shield my head, but his fury was relentless. Each blow made my vision blur, and I tasted blood again, thick and metallic in my mouth. My mother sobbed, her voice breaking. "Please, Harold, stop! You are killing her!" But he raised his fist again and snarled at her to stay quiet, or she would be next. My body felt heavy, my breaths shallow and ragged, and still he loomed above me. Somewhere in the chaos, I realized Madison was laughing softly as she filmed her eyes glittering with cruel delight. That was when I knew I needed to act. Through the haze of pain, I forced my hand under the couch, where I had hidden a small USB drive containing recordings of Harold's rages. My fingers trembled as I pushed it deeper beneath the fabric, hoping he would not notice. If I did not survive the night, maybe someone would find it. Suddenly, a loud knock rattled the front door. It was Evelyn, her voice calling out that she had heard shouting. Harold cursed under his breath and barked at Madison to keep her quiet. Madison darted to the door, telling Evelyn everything was fine, that we were just arguing over bills. Evelyn's voice was firm, suspicious, but eventually she stepped away, though I heard her mutter that she would be back. Harold turned back to me with renewed fury, dragging me up by the arm. "If anyone ever finds out what happens in this house, it will be the last thing you do," he hissed. He threw me against the wall, my head hitting the plaster with a dull thud that made stars dance in front of my eyes. I collapsed again, barely conscious, but through the blur, I saw the red light on Madison's phone still recording. She thought she was mocking me, but she was preserving the very evidence that would undo them. My chest heaved, my heart thundering erratically, and I wondered if this was the moment my body would finally give up. In a fleeting surge of clarity, I crawled toward my bedroom, clutching my side, and managed to slide the door shut before Harold could follow. I pressed the lock with trembling hands and crawled beneath the bed, where another phone, my secret recorder, was hidden. With the last of my strength, I pressed record again, whispering the date and describing what had just happened, my words slurring but clear enough. Then I tucked the device deep into my backpack. Outside the door, Harold pounded and shouted threats, his rage echoing through the walls. My mother cried, begging him to leave me alone, but her voice was drowned out. As the pounding grew louder, I felt darkness pulling at me again, but this time there was a flicker of hope. Even if my body failed, even if Harold's fists silenced me, my evidence was safe. Somewhere outside, Evelyn would not ignore what she had heard, and Ethan, who had been texting me all evening without reply, might soon realize something was terribly wrong. I clutched my backpack against my chest as the world went dim, praying that the pieces I had hidden away would be enough to tell the truth. The next morning, my body ached as though I had been struck by a truck, every breath stabbing my ribs, my lips swollen, my head pounding. Harold sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee as if nothing had happened while Madison scrolled through her phone, smirking. My mother moved like a shadow, silent and pale, cleaning dishes with trembling hands. I forced myself to sit upright, clutching my backpack where I had hidden the recorder, knowing that if I faltered now, all of my secret resistance would be wasted. By mid-afternoon, a knock shook the front door louder and more insistent than before. It was Evelyn, but she was not alone. 2 uniformed police officers stood beside her. My stomach flipped as Harold stood quickly, trying to mask his surprise with a false smile. "Officers, what seems to be the problem?" he said smoothly, but his voice carried an edge. Evelyn's eyes cut straight to me, her gaze lingering on the bruise blooming across my cheek and the way I held my side. "I heard more than enough last night," she said firmly. The officers stepped inside, one of them asking if everything was all right. Harold barked that it was a family matter and that Evelyn was interfering, but before he could continue, Evelyn produced a small flash drive. My heart skipped a beat. She must have found the copy I had slipped under her fence earlier that week, the backup plan I prayed I would never need. The officers plugged it into a laptop they carried, and suddenly Harold's voice filled the room, his drunken rants captured in crystal clarity. "You are nothing without me!" The recording echoed, followed by the sound of a slap. Madison gasped her phone, slipping from her hand while my mother covered her face, sobbing. Harold lunged toward Evelyn, shouting that it was fake, but the officers stepped between them. "Sir, you need to calm down," one said, his hand resting on his holster. I reached into my backpack with shaking hands and pulled out the recorder I had hidden. My voice, weak but steady, played through the speaker as I described the beatings, the dates, the threats. The evidence spoke louder than my trembling words ever could. Madison shrieked. She attacked Dad first, she provoked him, but one of the officers silenced her. The video on her phone, still unlocked, told a different story. My battered face on the screen, Harold's fists striking again and again, my mother crying in the background. The officers exchanged glances, then moved swiftly. They ordered Harold to place his hands behind his back. His face twisted in disbelief as cold metal cuffs clicked around his wrists. He shouted curses at me, at Evelyn, at the officers, but his voice no longer carried power. The neighbors had gathered outside, drawn by the flashing patrol car lights, their murmurs rising as they watched Harold dragged out in handcuffs. For years, he had been the man of the house, the loud voice everyone feared. Now he was just another criminal shoved into the back of a police car. Madison tried to protest, tears streaking her face, but when the officers replayed the clip from her own phone, she collapsed into sobs. My mother shook uncontrollably, then finally whispered, "It is true, everything she said is true," her voice breaking as if a dam had finally cracked. Evelyn wrapped an arm around her shoulders, steadying her. I was taken to the hospital where the fluorescent lights and the scent of antiseptic washed over me. The doctors examined my ribs, cleaned the cuts on my face, and hooked me to monitors. As I lay there exhausted and bruised, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his expression stricken. He hurried to my side and took my hand gently. "You are safe now," he whispered, his thumb brushing across my knuckles. Tears stung my eyes at the kindness in his voice, so different from the cruelty I had endured. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe it might be true. Justice had finally stepped through the door of Harold's house, and for once, I was not invisible. The days after Harold's arrest felt unreal, as if the world had tilted and I was learning how to walk on steadier ground for the first time. At the hospital, the detectives returned to gather my statement. My voice shook, but I told them everything, from the nights of shouting to the blows that left me crumpled on the floor to the recordings I had made in secret. They listened intently, assuring me that the case was strong. Harold faced charges of domestic violence assault and attempted murder. His history of control, the videos from Madison's phone, the recordings on my devices, and Evelyn's testimony formed a wall of evidence he could not climb. Madison herself was taken into juvenile custody for her role in enabling the abuse and filming instead of helping. When I heard the judge ordered her into a rehabilitation program, I felt a strange mixture of anger and pity. She had been poisoned by Harold's influence, and though she had hurt me deeply, she was still a child who had been taught cruelty as if it were love. My mother began attending therapy sessions almost immediately, encouraged by the hospital social worker. For years, she had been silent, a prisoner of Harold's dominance, and now she faced the guilt of her inaction. She told me through tears that she had failed me, that she had chosen fear over courage, and that she wanted to earn back the place of mother in my life. I listened quietly, my heart torn between pain and compassion, but I agreed to let her try. I moved in temporarily with Evelyn after I was discharged. Her small home smelled of lavender and lemon, and she filled the kitchen with warmth I had forgotten existed. She cooked meals for me, fussed over my bandages, and left the porch light on at night so I would never feel alone in the dark. Sometimes I would wake from nightmares drenched in sweat, hearing Harold's voice in my head. and she would sit with me until I calmed down. Ethan visited often carrying books and flowers, sometimes just sitting beside me without speaking. His presence was a balm, a quiet reminder that not all men raised their voices to dominate. One evening he read aloud from a collection of poems. I loved his voice steady, and I felt something in my chest unclench. For the first time since I was a little girl, I believed in the possibility of gentleness. Weeks turned into months, and the bruises on my skin faded, though the scars inside me remained. I began to write again, pouring my story into pages, not just as therapy, but as testimony. I started a small blog, anonymous at first, where I described life inside a toxic home. The manipulation, the silence, the small acts of resistance. To my surprise, people found it and responded. Other survivors left comments sharing their own pain and their own victories. The knowledge that I was not alone, that my words could help someone else, lit a fire inside me. When the trial began, I stood in court, my hands trembling, but my voice clear as I told the jury how Harold had tried to erase me. The videos played on the large screen, his voice echoing through the chamber, his fists striking in frame. He glared at me from the defense table, but his power was gone, dissolved under the weight of truth. The verdict came swiftly guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to many years in prison. The judge's gavel struck, and the sound was like a door slamming shut on the years of terror. My mother wept openly, not from sadness, but from release. Outside the courthouse, Ethan wrapped his arm gently around my shoulders and whispered, "Your heart did not give out that night, Lily. It just started beating for yourself." Those words stayed with me. I moved back into our old house eventually, but only after locks were changed and alarms installed. My mother and I rebuilt slowly each day, a fragile step toward trust. Madison's absence left silence in the halls, and though the house carried memories of pain, I filled it with new ones. I wrote at the kitchen table without fear of my notebooks being torn apart. I cooked dinner without insults. I laughed sometimes awkwardly, but with growing ease. I am 20 now, scarred but alive, and though my story began with fists and blood, it did not end there. It ended with justice, with healing, with a voice no longer silenced, and it continues with hope.